Thanks everybody for coming today. We are here doing another awesome interview with a TTP student who absolutely crushed the GMAT focus. So we're excited to talk about that. Before we get into that, just a few things here. If you are enjoying this interview and you're watching this, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video because we want everybody to be enjoying these as much as humanly possible. Leave comments for us because we will be back, I'm sure, doing more of these. So now we can kind of jump in. So Dhruv is here. He is a target test prep student. He recently took the GMAT focus. He did incredibly well. As you can see, he went from a 635 to a 755, which is an amazing, amazing score. Q85, V90, D, I88. So really, really good splits on that score. So today we're going to talk about what he did to get to that place, how he used target test prep, and hopefully you guys can get some really good insights from him that you can apply to your own GMAT. So Dhruv, thank you for joining today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, Jeff, thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to chat about this.
Good, awesome. Well, I guess a great place always to start with these interviews is your background, kind of where you came from up to this point. So let's start there. Why don't you give everyone some color on that?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm actually currently a graduate student at the University of Virginia. I'm pursuing my master's of public policy with a focus in development finance and international finance. Kind of the context there is my interest is applying to deferred MBAs, and so that's currently what I'm in the process of doing. So the deferred MBA cycle, where I'm probably going to work in industry for about 3 to 4 years, and then hopefully return to pursue that MBA. I'm going to be working in the restructuring and special situations advisory industry as an investment banker for the next 3 to 4 years. And so, kind of fingers crossed on the MBA side of things and getting admitted, but that's where I am right now.
Awesome. And you plan to apply, I guess, pretty soon, right? Now that you have your GMAT score locked up, or have you already started the application process?
Yeah. So I've already started the application process. The schools that I'm interested in are on a rolling basis, and so I'm applying to 5 schools, and then 3 of those schools have or their deadlines have passed, and I've submitted my applications for those, and then 2 schools will have their deadlines in the next week or so.
All right, awesome. So good. That sounds must be nice getting that load off your shoulders, not worrying about the GMAT or applications at this point.
Yeah, for sure, definitely.
All right, cool. Well, obviously everybody's here to learn about what you did for the GMAT. So I guess why don't you start at the beginning, when you decided you wanted to study for the GMAT. We know you did it in 2 months, but what you were kind of estimating for how much time you would need, all the things you kind of thought about at the beginning of the process and how you kind of jumped into the whole process.
Yeah, for sure. So I kind of planned to apply to deferred MBAs. That's been a thing for a while in my intention. So as I finished my last year of school, I did a undergrad master's joint. So the GMAT kind of the thought process there was I had it originally scheduled in January. So I started prepping for the GMAT back in last fall. I used a lot of the MBA.com official prep materials. So I got their official guidebooks and then the section specific guidebooks. Worked through those relatively more of a skim, not necessarily probably every question was answered, but I definitely looked at those. And then I had taken a few of the MBA.com practice GMAT focus exams that's available through that platform. And so that's what I had done probably through starting maybe as early as October and then going through October, November, December. And then I took my first GMAT focus exam. I believe the date was January 6th. That was actually kind of the idea of I was hoping for that to be my final exam. I was hoping for not to have to retake it, but
Right.
and I got a good score. So I scored a 635 back in January. But I really thought that I could get it higher, especially just with how my splits were set up. That I had a really strong verbal analysis split, but my quant splits were not as strong, and so that's where in January, mid January, I was looking at different prep softwares for the GMAT focus, and I had a couple friends, couple people here at the McIntyre School of Commerce at UVA, and then kind of like online forums that had recommended Target Test Prep as the software to really be able to get like underways and prep for the GMAT focus. And so I started that in January. I scheduled my GMAT focus for mid-March. So I utilized the software for about 2 months. That was going through the mission structure. Again, since my reading back, like verbal insights background was kind of
Right.
strong, I focused more on the quant insight and the data insight sections. So I worked through the mission plan there, kind of targeting specifically and making sure to focus on the areas that I knew that I was weakest in. And then I ultimately took the GMAT back in March. I think it was like March 23rd. It might be the date, and that's when I scored the 175, the 755.
Yeah, 175, totally
Yeah,
different
absolutely.
score.
Yeah.
Well, real quick, I forgot to mention, if you guys have questions throughout this interview, put them in the chat box so we can answer them in real time. That way we can kind of gear things towards what you all are wondering about. So, what you did when you started your prep is pretty common. Like a lot of people are like, oh, I'll grab the OG and I'll do some practice tests. I mean, in retrospect, and we can get into target test prep in a few, but in retrospect, are you looking back at that initial process and saying, that wasn't quite the structure I needed, and maybe it wasn't necessarily the time to be doing those questions because you were so early on in the process?
Yeah, and so I think in retrospect, I would have started it differently and probably started right with a software like Target Test Prep. There's a few aspects to it, and I think that uh, not to give away like everything, but like the software has a lot of hints, which I think is really helpful. Specific
Hmm.
test taking strategies, specific like section specific strategies, and so like in retrospect, there's a lot of things that I benefited from that I probably would not have been able to benefit from without having that type of insight. So like the OG materials, they're good at giving you kind of an understanding of some of the questions. They
Hmm.
just aren't nearly as strong as in helping you think about how to answer questions effectively, how to
Right.
be able to do well on certain questions. And so I think, half of the GMAT focus, especially with it being on a time crunch, is being able to see a question and recognize what, concept is it asking. And that's something the target test prep really honed in on and focused on is, hey, you see something like this is probably what it's going to be
Right.
testing you on. And so this is how you can think
Hmm.
about it and be able to come to an answer quickly, which the OG materials like really don't do.
Yeah, and it's not a shock why GMAC makes them, and they want to give you official questions, but they don't want to give away the farm either. So
Exactly.
yeah, and it's interesting because the questions are good. But a lot of times when students want extra practice, we say, hey, like do those at the end of your prep, not the beginning, to use
Hmm.
them for extra practice. And again, we'll get into TTP in a sec. There is a question: how to build and improve the basic concepts for quants. You, you started off pretty well, so if you if you want me to answer it, I can, or if you have some thoughts too, feel
Yeah, I'm
free.
happy to tackle that, and
Okay,
then
great,
you can fill in any holes that I'm missing.
awesome. Okay.
Um, so I have, my undergrad was a little bit more STEM focused, and so I, but it was in a field that wasn't as math heavy. It's like math
Right.
heavy that would be tested on, and then same with my master's, and so I haven't really touched a lot of the foundational concepts since maybe high school, and so one thing that and TTP teaches this really important like lesson, and I think this was something that was kind of profound to me was the idea that there are the concepts that are being tested at different difficulty levels is must be approached different ways, and so TTP does a really good job at teaching you the lessons. Like so, you're going through like almost like a textbook like structure with interactive questions, and then having you do
Hmm.
a set of easy questions, a set of medium questions, a set of hard questions, and I was probably a bit overconfident in that, like I kind of was just jumping straight to the hard questions, and so I was doing fine on those. But one thing that I really realized was the importance of building from those easy to hard questions to get those foundations locked in, so that you're able to more effectively answer the questions in the actual exam.
Yeah, no, I mean, all that's accurate. I think if you are starting from the bottom, working on a foundation, the key is spending the necessary time you need to build the foundation because the tendency is I want to be done with this as quick as possible. I don't want to be here 6 months, and some people need to be. And the problem is, if you skim through the foundations and then you try to jump into these real GMAT questions, what you'll start to realize is the foundations make up a very high percentage component of these questions. So if the foundations aren't there, then there's no possible way you're going to be able to get through those harder questions. I mean, it's like, I don't know, like learning how to ride a skateboard and then being like, well, I don't really know how to ride a skateboard, but I'm going to jump into a half pipe. Like it doesn't work. Odd analogy, but I think we can all envision that in our heads. So yeah, when it comes to the foundations, take your time, be topical with it. I think you probably notice in TTP, topical learning is like a really big part of what we're doing. And look, if your foundations are that low, you may need to even go outside the world of GMAT to build those up. Just regular algebra questions, fraction rules, decimal rules, all that stuff. It does stem from, your basic high school, middle school math stuff. So sometimes you may need to do a little bit extra before getting into GMAT. So that's hopefully a way that you can deal with it. If you're unsure, take a practice test, get a baseline score, and then kind of go from there. Um, Another question, and then we will get into how you started your TTP journey. Did you feel? Oh, it just raised above here. Did you feel the actual exam? There you go. To be of easier. Okay, was the real test easier, on par, harder? What did you when you compared it? What did you think?
Yeah, so this was where I was actually most surprised. I don't think the exam was necessarily easier or harder than the mocks. I think that it was paced differently. And what I mean by that, and maybe this is just an anecdotal experience, is that my experience with the actual exam is that it started off easier and got
Mhm.
much harder.
Right.
And I compared to the mock exams. And so I think the mock exams, the questions were accurate to what you would see on the exam in some way. I do think that the way that the mock exams were set up, in my experience, was not as representative of my official GMAT focus exams. And I think the getting that the foundational understanding and being able to work through those quickly and identify the questions, which is why I really think my score went up so much by using TTP, was
Right.
really essential in tackling that differential between the mock exams and the official GMAT focus exams.
So are you kind of implying too that, like, obviously the GMAT exams, did you find more of like a variety of content on the real test versus those? Okay,
I found a
gotcha.
more variety of difficulty on the real test. I think the easier, in my experience at least, the easier questions were easier, the harder questions were harder
Okay.
compared to the mock exams provided.
Right. So it seemed like the mock exams were more towards the middle 80%, and the
For
real
sure.
test had okay. Well, as we always say, getting those easy questions wrong can be killer. So the fact
For
that they
sure.
were easier means you got those right and worked your way up to the harder questions quicker, and getting those harder questions wrong isn't the end of the world. I know you don't know if you got them wrong per se, but I think that shows how you can still get a really good score. You don't need to get all of the 80th, 90th percentile questions right. So
For
that's
sure.
really, really interesting. And you took all of the MBA.com practice exams?
I took 4 total.
Okay, got it. So,
GMAT Focus, MBA.com practice exams, I took 4 in their entirety. 2 of them
okay.
I took completely untimed, and then 2 of them I took fully timed.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's interesting. And as everyone knows, there's six, but the four that you pay for, three, four, five, and six, you can actually repeat them once, and you'll see fresh questions, which is nice. Um, Another question is, in which selection order did you use, and did you feel that it's somehow section adaptive? I'm not sure if you had, like, the
Yeah, so I
wherewithal
was
mid-test to think about that, but
no,
maybe in
yeah, that's definitely
retrospect.
fair. I was pretty consistent in doing my quant section first, then taking the 10-minute break, then doing the verbal question section, and then doing the data insight section back to back. For me, I think that was really effective, splitting the data insights and the quant question, because it forced me to kind of shift thought process maybe this is the way of thinking of it, but like rest the quant side of my brain while focusing on the verbal side and then being able to go back to it. When it comes to section adaptiveness, that was actually a question that came up in my head, and I think that's such a fair question. I can't really confirm or deny from my experience, but it is something that came up where it's like, I do feel to some extent that performing well on an earlier section could make the later section start at a slightly harder baseline. But I also think that they're
Right.
testing such different concepts that you really
Yeah.
aren't able to distinguish that fully. And so I think the software, at least my understanding, communicates that there is no section adaptiveness and that each
Right.
section is pretty standalone. It is something that, and I find it funny that that question's asked because in the middle of the exam, I did have that thought process of
Hmm.
if the sections are adaptive.
No, you must have been doing well if you could have those extracurricular thoughts going on in your head mid-test. Um, all right, so that's all super interesting. How did you? So you found TTP. It was recommended. You got the
Mhm.
course. Now, how did you start using it? You know, there's a lot to it. You know, there's a study plan. What kind of worked well for you? Like, what was your process as you dove into target test prep?
Yeah, so I started off with I think it's like a preliminary, I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's like a screening exam to kind of just get your foundational, so that the software can get a foundational understanding of your abilities. It is kind of close to the length of a full exam, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
So I took that. I took that. That was a nice baseline for kind of understanding like where I am relative to my peers, what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, and then I, as much as I could, really followed that mission structure. I think the mission structure of TTP, especially with how it integrates strategies and iterative learning, is really helpful to the and I haven't really done any other target test prep softwares, but I think it was a
Right.
relatively unique component of the software. And so the way that your mission structure is set up is that you are learning a set of lessons that for a specific topic. You are then going through and kind of analyzing. Oh, sorry, actually, sorry. You're starting with a refresher of questions of all the previous sections you've done, and so it's going to be a set of
Yes.
questions and a quiz that is kind of meant to make sure that you're iteratively locking in long memory type learning for those
Yes.
concepts. You're then going through kind of like an interactive textbook type thing. If anyone in college had an interactive textbook in like a finance or an accounting class, it's kind of that type of approach, which I found really helpful. And instead of just having it straight reading from it, you read a section, you get like this is what you absolutely need to know from the section, and then you get like an easy, medium, hard question related to that section. You go through that entire chapter functionally, and then you take a number of preparatory questions. So you take, I think it's like anywhere from a lot of the sections are probably like 3 sets of 15 easy questions, 3 sets of like 12 medium questions, and 3 sets of like 10 hard questions. That's at least what I'm remembering. And I
Yep.
think that was probably that order was one of the most helpful things for locking in concepts for me. And so there were just concepts that I probably haven't needed to know and haven't learned and probably wouldn't have fully locked in because just I haven't touched them in years. And so having that textbook interactive textbook approach and then a set of easy questions, a set of medium questions, a set of hard questions, super helpful. There's one thing that I think that makes the test prep software different than just running mocks. And I realize this is that when you're running mocks, you are oftentimes making yourself retake questions that if you have a set amount of prep time, you're redoing questions that you probably don't need to
Right.
focus on as much, and you're not
Hmm.
locking in memories of concepts because you have to apply 30 concepts in the span of 2 hours. And
Right.
so the way of being able to lock in on one concept and really going deep on that was really helpful. And I think you can answer and get a lot more reps in the target test prep software system than you could through like the OG system.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and then so it's a fine balance, right? And that's why, as you were saying, we have the quizzes at the beginning of the missions. We also have the larger review quizzes, and we have the custom test builder if you ever want to build those tests. So yeah, when you're learning the stuff, being hyper focused on that stuff is important because like any topic has a lot to it. Like if you look at the topic of rates, it's not like, oh, I just need to know that rate times time is distance. It's how is that very basic formula used throughout all of these different types of rate questions? So if you're just practicing a few at a time, it becomes problematic as far as getting all that stuff down. So yes, you are 100% correct on that, and that's why we kind of hammer that home as far as what we want students doing throughout the study plan. So it sounds like then you were somewhat loosely following that order, and then because you were at a pretty good level, kind of picking and choosing your spots as to like what you went deep in versus what you kind of went through quickly, and then following like the scoring data from all of those chapter tests. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, so I think the early missions are very foundational concepts, and I made sure to do all of those. And I think the way that the mission structure is set up is intentional in its order.
Yes.
But you have the first half of missions, which I think are very foundational and good to do. Then you have your second half of missions, which are kind of very more focused on niche types of questions that you would see in the exam. And so there were, say there's 10 concepts, there were 5 concepts that I knew that I was pretty strong on and I had historically performed well on. And so given that I started getting into a bit of a time crunch, entirely a function of my own procrastination, not the software.
Right.
Given that, I skipped past those missions and focused on the missions that I knew I was weakest in. And
Right.
so, like for example, I think I was pretty good at the rates, the percents, the ratios type chapter, and like I historically
Hmm.
performed quite well on that. And so I skipped that chapter, and then I went over to your like set series and probability, which I knew that I historically performed pretty poorly on. I do think that
Right.
those early missions that are more foundational are something that you probably shouldn't skip because I think the later sections really build off of concepts in those earlier sections.
Yeah, I mean they're foundational slash technical. They're less
Mhm.
word problem esque. And look, what you did isn't wrong. I think people come to TTP at different places in their journey. If you're just starting out, you can't necessarily pick and choose your spots because maybe everything is necessary. But if you've been at it for a little bit, or you're scoring in the lowish, midish 600s, it's possible that some of the stuff well. So in that case, but it's again following the data. If you do the chapter tests, you see how you perform, and then you can decide like, okay, well, I got 100% on this easy test. Does it mean I can go to the medium? So those are all decisions you can make in real time as you're going through the course to use it strategically. And again, some people might need the whole thing. It just really depends who you are as a student, but that's why the course is set up and flexible so you can kind of use it fully to your advantage. Um, Another question. Oh, and before I do, another reminder, if you're enjoying this, like, subscribe, please. We love doing these interviews, so we're hoping everyone's learning a lot from Dhruv here. Next question. Did you skip any of the questions during the exam? Wondering whether extremely high scores are achievable through skipping, if that's something that can be possible. So yeah,
Yeah,
how did that work?
so I didn't skip any questions per se, and I'll kind of expand on that. One thing that I've actually been curious about, and I'm not sure if there's an answer to it, is how a dynamic test interfaces with the ability to skip and go back to questions. And
Right.
I'm not fully sure on the answer of that because the idea is if you get a question wrong, the next question should be an easier question. But
Correct.
if you go back and you were to get, say that it's 20 questions, you were to get 3 questions wrong, so you're at a 17 out of 20, you go back and you fix those 3 answers and they're all correct and you're a 20 out of 20. I'm not sure if
Right.
your score ends up being a perfect score. I did in the reading section, like skip in quotes 2 questions, go back, fix them, and I got a 90. So in some ways, that kind of confirms the idea that you're not necessarily penalized for skipping. What I did though is I don't necessarily skip a question. I have kind of I try to give myself like a time limit of a minute 30. If I'm truly lost on a concept, I'm going to jot it down on my whiteboard and make sure that I circle
Right.
back at the end. I don't think that it's necessarily helpful to see a question and instantly be like, this is a question that I need to skip and get back to because it's going to take me too much time.
Right.
Mainly because like you can't guarantee that you're going to have enough time at the end. The
Right.
test is really a time crunch, and you may believe that you have the time proportion, but then you know that the later questions are going to get harder, and so you
Yeah.
can't necessarily know that you're going to be able to keep the pace that you want to keep. And so, did I come circle back and change my answers on a couple of the questions? Yes. Did I jot down probably 3 to 4 questions per section that I'm like I should probably circle back and check these? Yeah. But I also think that it's helpful to make sure that you try to answer every question. And usually, I think to some extent, you can get the answers down to 2 to 3 choices out of the 4 to 5.
Right.
And I would try to do that, pick an answer, and then move on. Never, stay with a question longer than 3 minutes or 2:30, I guess, if
Right.
you feel like you're just not making any progress on it.
Yeah, agreed. And you'll know, you should have that gut feeling where you say, okay, this one's really, I'm in the weeds big time. So I'm going to mark an answer, come back to it, and potentially change the answer if I have time. Did you change any answers or did you adjust any questions or no?
Yeah, so I changed 2 answers on my verbal insight section. They were back-to-back answers about the same passage, which I still completely don't understand, to
Oh,
be so
wow.
honest. Yeah, this is I find this kind of funny for the verbal insight section. I'm kind of the opinion that the readings don't get that much harder necessarily, and the questions kind of just get a bit more, tricky in how they're framed, and
Hmm.
so there's that aspect there. And then the data insight section, there was one answer at the end that I was going back to try to change, like to see if I could come up with a better answer, and then I ran out of
Right.
time.
Got it. Well, at least but you had it marked. So,
Yeah, so
and
I had it
submitted.
marked. I went through the entire test. It was kind of like a topography map, like analysis type thing, and so
Right.
I knew that that was going to take time, and so I answered it, moved on. When at the end, I circled back to see if I could change my answer, and I didn't really have time to
Right.
change it.
Got it. Yeah, and to your question, like, yeah, no one truly knows the effect. Obviously, they let you do it. I don't think they would allow you to do it if it puts you at a disadvantage for doing so. But maybe what happens is you get partial credit for so it's worth 75% of what it normally would be if you get it right on the first try. But then again, if you mark it from correct to wrong, I don't
Mhm.
know, maybe it's 75% of that too. Like, so it goes in both directions. But
Yeah,
until
that makes
GMAC,
sense.
yeah, until GMAC tells us, we really won't know. But yeah, it seems like it's a nice feature. I know it's limited in what you can go back and fix, but I don't even know if you'd have time to fix more because you're right. You can say, hey, I'm going to save time. And that may make sense to you in the moment, but 5 questions later, if you get hung up on something, who's to say you're going to stick to that mindset? You're going to be like, oh, well, I need 3 more minutes. You're going to take the 3 more minutes, but then that extra 3 minutes is now blown and you're not going to have the time to deal with it at the end. So I agree. Don't, rush through a question. Just put something.
For sure. And then from a psych basis, most individuals are more likely to probably want to mark down and circle back to a question that was early on or middle in the test. And that's
Right.
going to happen on a question that's easier. And so your pacing is going to completely change the later
Right.
you get in the exam.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the thing. You don't want to be doing that with the easiest of the questions. And sometimes you might think something is easy and it's hard or hard and easy. You don't know, and we'll never know. So that's another key point is not trying to guess that stuff. Just do the best you can with what's in front of you and then make strategic decisions question by question. Um, all right, so that everything you said sounds great. I mean, like I said, the way that you studied, how you use TTP. Um, did you here's another question. What is your time tracking method of choice? Did you use checkpoints? Do you allow yourself more time at MSR and RC? If so, how many extra minutes for your pacing? I guess that means in those sections. Yeah. So do you have a timing strategy based on the section or how did you deal with all of that?
Yeah, sorry. And this might be silly on my end. MSR and RC standing for,
Critical reasoning and then multi-source reasoning for MSR. So
okay,
MSR
for,
is,
got it.
yeah, in
Yeah,
the
yeah. Got it.
right. Yep.
Um, I didn't have a different time strategy necessarily. What I tried to do is, I think my goal was to keep it at about keep it my first half of the test at about a minute 30 per question, and the second half of the test at about like a 2 minutes per question. Like that was the goal that I was aiming for. For
Hmm.
some of the reading questions, I probably assumed that there was 3 to 4 questions related to that reading, and so if the first reading question took more time because I had to read through the passage, I didn't really worry about that. I just made sure. I think one thing that's really helpful with the data insight section and the verbal section related to readings and passages you have to analyze is try to read through the passage the first time um, with the mindset of being able to answer multiple questions about it. Because I think a common
Hmm.
strategy is you look at the first question and then you do the reading. And so you're scanning the reading to answer the first question. But
Yeah,
then you have to do that every time and you run out of
agreed.
time. And
Yep.
so I personally, and this is just what worked for me, I didn't look at the question when I did the reading. I tried to do the reading in full, be able to think about it in a way that would allow me to answer multiple questions about it, and then looked at the question, circled back to the reading to see like, hey, like what is this specifically looking at? Because usually it's like a check the highlighted section or check paragraph two
Right.
or and stuff like that. And so I would do the full reading and then be able to quickly run through the questions related to it.
Yeah. No, that's really great advice. We advise at TTP stuff similar. I mean, first of all, you're right. If you look at the first question, you're going to be reading with a bias. And then you're going to get to that answer potentially. And then you're going to stop and you're going to answer it. And then what do you know? Well, at that point, nothing. And the thing is, I even tell people to take very rudimentary notes just to make sure you're reading carefully. You're probably never going to use those notes because they're probably going to be in chicken scratch, but at least you know you've jotted down key points. And even if you remember 30% of what you did there, you're probably going to be able to relocate that stuff in the passage quicker. And every time you go back to the passage, your knowledge will get stronger and stronger and stronger. So by the time you get to the last question, you'll know where the arguments are and where the contradictions are or whatever. So yeah, I agree. If you piecemeal it from the beginning, then you're going to piecemeal it with every question and you're never going to have, one of the things I say is this test is all about confidence, right? And I'd be curious to hear about yours in a second. I'm guessing it was high, but like this is on the macro and the micro. So if you're reading through RC passage and you start to really understand it, that means your confidence is high. Like, oh, I know exactly what they're saying. I know it. The reverse happened to you in one passage because you said I still don't know what it was saying. But that aside, most of them you probably did understand, and you got more of an understanding as you continue to answer questions and reattack the passage and reattack the passage. So yeah, to me, confidence is huge. And with that in mind, like on the test itself, plus in some small micro areas, did you feel you had a high level of confidence throughout? Did you feel your confidence grew as you were like, oh wow, like they're testing me on this like minute math concept that I know this is going to be a good day? Like how did that go for you?
Yeah, so a couple different points, and I'm going to actually circle back to the first question first, the previous question first. With the approach to multi-source reasoning and the readings,
Right.
for the readings, definitely do the full reading. I do think the multi-source reasoning within the data insight section, where you have multiple tabs to click on, that one you can approach a little bit more piecemeal, just because typically it's
Yeah.
math related to a specific section. And sorry, it took me a second to recall that. And so your questions are almost, at least in my experience, the sequence of your questions are probably going to be related to the sequence of the tabs.
Oh, interesting.
Um, and so your first question on a multi-source reasoning might be only related to the first tab. Your second question might be related to the first and second, but typically, like you can be a little bit more piecemeal there. Um,
Right.
the other thing that I would think about for the reading sections that have multiple questions that I think is really helpful, and it was helpful in me circling back and actually understanding that question that I was confused on, is try to, if you can, think of the questions in context with each other. Because if you have four questions about a passage and one question kind of gives a little bit of insight into how the grader or the reader or the software wants you to think about a question, it might also make you answer the previous question a little bit differently. And so that's something that
Right.
I would keep in mind there. Answering your actual question about confidence,
Yeah.
the GMAT is weird, and dynamic tests are weird because the better you're doing, the worse you're gonna feel,
Yep.
because the test is getting harder. And so I think it's really something kind of like something you have to tell yourself where the difficulty of the question that I'm experiencing doesn't necessarily tell me how I am doing on this exam, especially because when you're in within the quant section and there's like five different concepts being tested, my
Right.
understanding is that they scale the difficulty individually for those sub-concepts. And so if you're performing really good on 4 concepts out of the 5 and you're performing poorly on 1, then you might
Hmm.
get a really easy question for that one. But that doesn't mean that you're performing poorly on the exam. And
Right.
so if you're seeing hard questions and you're getting stressed out about that, I do think, it doesn't hurt to tell yourself, hey, hard question means that I'm doing well. Um, or at least, like, especially if you're seeing a trend of questions getting harder. But I think that you're absolutely right, Jeff, that the confidence of going into an exam is really important. You kind of need to have the mindset that you are going to be able to get through and answer questions confidently and be able to do the test well. And I think being able to answer questions confidently and saving even, like that 5 seconds of hesitance per question can make all the difference in finishing the exam. And because for me, I think one of the hardest aspects, especially during the quant section and the data insight section, was that time crunch. And so
Right.
if I wasn't confident in my mindset in approaching the exam, I don't think I would necessarily have been able to finish those sections. And so
Right.
you're definitely right that going into those exams, going into the exam with the level of confidence that you've done your prep, you know the concepts. Um, this exam's what it is, and I think if your exam doesn't end up well, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have been confident, right? Because that means you prep more and you take the exam again, and so you have to take the exam confidently, knowing that you are where you are in your abilities, and it's going to reflect on the exam.
Yep. Totally agree. And someone asked, it's more like how you handle the test and skills required to sell at the test. And yes, I agree. I agree with that
Definitely.
100%. Um, Another question: did you take notes in reading comprehension or critical reasoning? If so, what's your approach?
Yeah. So reading comprehension, it's funny. So I think try to like jot down things like scratch notes, but less. For me, I took less notes in the reading comprehension section. One thing that is noticeable, and I kind of like pulled this from like my cog sci background is if you write something down as you read it, you're more likely to remember the location of it on the passage. And so it doesn't hurt to jot down, like if you're reading a passage and you see like a random word, jot down the random word on your notepad. You're more likely to be able to quickly recall where it is so you can answer a question related to that random word. I didn't do nearly as many notes on the like the reading, the verbal section readings. The data insight section readings, and the multi-source reasoning questions, I did to some extent take notes. And I think what I did there was more of like when you had to map something across multiple tabs, I made sure to jot down like how they related. And so, you might have a tab where it's like you have 4 different categories, and those 4 categories manifest in 2 different subcategories on the next tab. But there's some information on the 4 categories in the previous tab. I would just quickly jot down that information, be like A equals red, like something like that,
Right.
because
Hmm.
that saves you time. And so I think your thought process with jotting notes down should be from an efficiency perspective of what makes it so that I have to switch tabs the least amount to answer
Right.
questions.
Makes sense. Yeah. Totally agree with that. All right. So you worked through TTP, you got towards the end, and then you started retaking or taking new practice exams. So you took a couple more after target test prep was done, right? Um,
So I didn't actually. I just used the target test prep software
Oh, and you
and
went
went
right
straight.
into the
Yeah.
wow. Okay, wow. Okay, well, I wouldn't recommend that,
Sorry.
but
Yeah.
it worked out for Dhruv perfectly. He got a 755. I would say definitely take practice tests. I mean, that's super cool to hear. But you had experience with the test previously, so it wasn't like you would. I mean, you took a real one. You had taken other practice tests. I mean, for most
Right.
students, yes, take as
And
many
I also like.
you
I mean,
can.
I didn't take practice tests themselves, but I did focus it on doing question reps.
Right.
So I took like beginning of the target test prep. What I was doing, I was definitely doing the full do the readings, do the questions, do the questions. Sorry, do the readings with like the questions in them, and then do like the easy, medium, hard questions before my exam. Definitely would recommend taking practice tests, but what I had done is I just did straight questions and I didn't do like the readings associated with them. And so
Mhm.
that was kind of like a similar outcome in how it was prepping me for it.
Got it. Okay. Cool. Yeah. No, I mean it's super interesting, and I guess one of the things mean, a lot of great information has been shared today. I think it's very clear what your process was like, how you use target test prep. So I think we hit on a lot of that stuff. I guess what I would have you leave with is if you have some parting advice on like top things as somebody starting to prep for this thing, like what is some like major advice that you would have for them that you think could really be beneficial?
Yeah. And I think you kind of touched on this a lot, that going into your prep for the GMAT, one of the most important things to know and be able to like accept, I guess, is where you are in your prep process. And I think that that's going to be really important in setting not just someone who has a strong background or a weak background, but everyone for success if you know where you're at and being able to approach that effectively. And so if you know that you have you have a large amount of like background in the space, don't just do the hard questions. And I think this is where like I really messed up, and I think this is where
Right,
TTP helped the most is do the easy question reps, do the mid question reps. It makes a world of difference in making you effective and efficient in your actual GMAT. If you're coming from a background that doesn't have nearly as much of a background in these types of questions, make sure you focus in on those readings. And I think at least my understanding is that the target test prep software is built to not necessarily assume that you have much background, and the readings and the chapters
yeah,
do a really good job of building from a foundation of like no background in the space. And so go through those readings, and I think actively going through those readings is going to be helpful.
right,
One thing that I found to be the most helpful is that you're going to see a full chunk of reading, but to make sure that you're actually actively learning. When you see like this is the apps, like this is what you need to know, or like make sure you know this, jot that down in your notes if you're instead of just scrolling through a screen. If you do that, you're going to come away with so much more knowledge, even then just like compared to just like reading that passage. And so I think that's really helpful in being able to build your foundations and understand the concepts. And I think the last thing is kind of the software, and I really appreciated this, is it teaches you a base concept, and then it teaches you manifestations of that concept that can show
yes,
up on the GMAT. And I think
hmm,
those, like having those manifestations described to me,
right,
specifically thinking about like combinations and permutations and like how you can have like multiple sets together, or like
right,
excluding, or certain things can't be next to each other. Like
yep,
being able to have that explained to me after and in connection to the foundations, super helpful. And I really think that like having that approach to being able to not only get like a foundational understanding, but a test taking understanding of different iterations and manifestations of those questions was super helpful.
yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, 100%. And that's a huge part of what we had in mind when we built this course. And we continue to improve on that and tinker and add stuff. So yeah, man. I mean, again, like with many of these before, proofs in the pudding. You went in, you did what you needed to do, you used the course to your advantage, you came out with a 755, like a score that anyone would be thrilled with. So, I just want to thank you again for sharing your insights and spending some time. I know you probably want to put all this behind you, so now you can officially put it behind you and just focus on regular life. I hope everyone here and everyone who will be watching has gotten a lot out of this. And I will say again, please like the video, please subscribe. There's some really cool stuff that you can see beyond this interview, and there'll be more as well in the future. So, Drew, thank you so much for hanging out and talking a little bit. And thanks to everybody for watching. So, yeah, man, it's really
Perfect.
appreciated.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for having me. It was a great opportunity to talk about it. So have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. We're here if you need us, and study hard. We'll talk soon.